This is somewhat embarrassing to always phrase these recordings as, or frame them as a kind of, as a weird kind of multiple endeavor that's slightly confused. Like, am I making a political primer when I'm generally trying to, I guess, provide some level of just sense making and coherence on these very complicated topics? Anyway, I'm going to explore the very confusing issues of confronting identity politics and the proponents of identity politics, and explore suggest certain ways of tackling what they do rhetorically. I think on some level, because what they're doing is so confusing and complicated, and I will get into the detail of that sort of complexity, and because essentially if you try to address that complexity, they can very easily make mockery of you. They can pin up what you're saying as being convoluted, and sadly what you say has to sound convoluted if you're going to address what they're doing in detail, because it's all hidden in the presumptions, in the basic premise of their whole point of view, in the subtext, as it were, in the so it's all happening in this underhanded way, essentially. And in some sense, the complexity of that is quite interesting, because they make some sort of claims which they take to be kind of moral, and then they add that with their kind of hidden premises and their dependence on stereotyping racial identity and racial groups, and depending on certain stable icons in order to cement this oversimplified reduction of reality into something that makes sense to their ideological vision, as it were. And so they've got this supposedly well-intentioned ends justify the means, combined with these hidden premises, and together that actually brings together what is essentially racial realism. Because essentially, if you call them a racial realist, they might rebuff that label, because they'll say, no, but we claim that race is socially constructed, so how can we be racial realists? But essentially, yeah, okay, so that's the convoluted complexity, and I mean, it's an interesting thing to intellectually explore in itself, and you have to kind of be able to go through all that conceptual work. If you ever get bogged down into the detail, I think you need to know both. You need to know the detail, and then you need to work out clever shorthand ways of denoting what they're doing. And in some sense, you need a shorthand. You need a summarized critique of the particular, the common way that they deploy certain things. You have to have common answers to that. And in some sense, those answers, those quick quips that you would answer to that, are going to seem slightly strange. But I think that you have to use a certain summaried shorthand of strange responses that are fundamentally mysterious, because they have the detail packed behind it, and essentially they are set up as a kind of Trojan horse, that essentially you say these things, and then if they're challenged, then you have the detail to back them up. Then you say, oh, you see, you're not interested in actually working out what I was saying. You were just trying to make a mockery of what I was saying, because you pretend to be intellectual, but you're just pseudo-intellectual, and you just pretend to have this system that's worked out. But that's why my shorthand quip applies to you. You're just a kind of identity monger, or something like that. And so and it's also interesting as well, because in some sense this is the only way that you can deal with what they're doing, because they can't get into the real intellectual rational debate. Essentially their ideology, because it's fundamentally premised in this racial realism, is anti-fragile. It doesn't substantiate its claims that it depends on. It kind of has this, this kind of puzzle piece, and because half of the puzzle pieces are subtextual and half of them are these claims which semantically, in some kind of positivistic, theoretical way, sound enlightened and sound like they, they kind of mimic some of the language in the Constitution, for instance. They've got that recipe, they've got those ingredients, which facilitate their depressing march into the doom spiral that is fascistic politics and fascistic culture, because essentially their way of conceptualizing society is the fascistic conception of society, is racial realism, is identity groups. And everyone being a token representative of their respective identity group. That's all it is that reality is reduced into everything is causal. Everything is a complete determinant on that identity designation. And so, the problem becomes the solution, that because the problem is that identity is unequal, then the solution is to give justice to the identity. So that's their problem and that's their solution. So, just superficially, I should have, it's easier to take it from the other stuff that I was talking about when I was getting into some of the detail. I could have continued to go on, but just to show the kind of where the murkiness comes from is the disjointing, the two elements essentially is that they don't fit well together. Just on a superficial level, you can see how these things don't work together. Is that that culture is expected, that if race is socially constructed, then the aggregate of all social construction is the product of the collective system that everyone is a part of. And so if race is socially constructed, and then if there are prime differences between people, i.e. their indigenous culture or their endogenous inheritance of historical circumstance, or whatever inheritance they are given by the system, if there are at least components of that which are unchosen, or basically they've got a formula of injustice, that injustice is that you inherit a cultural designation which doesn't enjoy total equality, that is unequal to some other cultural inheritance. And so you've got this culture which essentially ends up being this weird kind of ideological glue that fixes everyone into the same sausage factory arbitration over society, is that culture is fundamentally separate, but it should be equal. So we've got these separations that the system imposes on us, but that they should be equal. And so with that formulation, you can therefore be justified, according to the identity politics ideology, is imposing whatever you so wish onto people based on the amelioration of the differences in these identity groups. And so you can just take any outcome and just say, well, it's fundamental systemic injustice and systemic oppression. And you don't have to causally describe how those issues persist or maintain, or let's say are created in the present. They're only described in terms of their historical generation, in terms of their historical cause, but in terms of like any kind of pragmatic or efficient cause, and looking at them pragmatically in terms of how do you face them on the ground, they're always looked at as the problem that the identity has in terms of how the culture of inhabiting that identity is treated unequally in terms of the system. So every problem is a problem that belongs to identity. The justice belongs to the identity, not to the individual. And so this form of analysis is completely blind to actually dealing with challenges. Because fundamentally, if the challenge can be cloaked in a cultural difference, then it becomes unassailable, it becomes invulnerable, becomes a non-quantifiable element that has to just be facilitated, and it must receive an equal reward from the system or something like that. And so you fundamentally get into this, I mean, essentially this is where all the tension is hidden within the ideological framework, is that essentially, I mean, to put it simply, culture can't be equal in these terms. Cultures could never be considered equal. I mean, in some abstract sense of integrity and dignity, but I mean, in some sense, they're saying that culture must be equal, not in the sense of dignity and integrity, but they must be equal in terms of outcome, because that is the only measure of dignity and integrity. It is just based on cold outcome. And so essentially you get a kind of very strange reduction of culture, or there's a better way of phrasing this, but you can see how it is an affront to rationality and reason itself and reality itself, how it's fundamentally undermines, it's just completely surrealist and delusional. The idea that essentially somehow the system must be completely agnostic to someone's preferences or choices or cultural affiliation. Somehow, as long as you can associate any description to a designated group, which you can somehow say that the system foisted on you and you passively inherited it, then the system must also reward it equally, or something like that. And so, I mean, it's this weird kind of, I mean, I'm just abstracting it to some degree, but that's the kind of stupid logic that you kind of get into having to facilitate, essentially. And because that polemic, that problem, that issue, that ideological issue is so, I mean, it's such a strange problem to even consider, and it simply comes out of this almost this emotional gambit that if they can say that essentially that their opponents are trying to say that cultures aren't equal, then they can just label them a racist or something like that. But it's because they have essentially redefined equality to mean outcome. The more eloquent way of getting into these issues is to actually look at their philosophy, their philosophical components more in detail, that I kind of touched on earlier, which is the idea that so I mean the hidden premise is essentially, there are a lot of different ways to break this down, but the hidden premise generally is something like that not only is race socially constructed, but that reality is also socially constructed. And so that there's no shared metaphysic. It's all just social, it's all just sort of, everyone has their own cultural universe, as it were. And then any kind, so there can be no kind of commixture. There can be no there can be no transaction between these groups other than them independently defining any interaction with another group as essentially deviating from their own counterfactual, ideal, utopian. It's got this, yeah. All right. Probably, yeah. Sorry, I'm not finding the point at which I wanted to continue to elaborate from. It was near when I was starting to talk about this, and I was first kind of described close to the kind of around where the issue is, but I mean, the problem is that it relies on the axiom of transitivity, and it doesn't. Yeah, okay, I don't want to talk about that, but that is also another way of describing what the problem is. But I mean, that's also a broader philosophical problem that infects many other different forms of thinking. But okay, let me just get back to something relevant. So what can be said about yeah, I mean, I guess the most stable way to rhetorically defend against it is to make a defensive point. Is to first lay down some defensive points, and then you make an offensive remark. And then you say something about their ideological style of engagement and or their policy positions, and you deconstruct their underlying ideological malfeasance, essentially. To me, it is very important. I want to make so many different points on so many different topics. It's a bit unwieldy to sort of collect them all together in one recording, so I guess this is just going to be a general thought catalogue. Okay, so I want to comment on epistemic injustice and specifically on Catherine Elgin, and I'm going to do so in quite an embarrassing fashion because I am not recently familiar with. This would come out much easier in dialogue or something like that, but there is something definitely rotten in the state of Denmark, as it were. There is something in which, yeah, it still baffles me how so much of Catherine Elgin's work can be so pristine and coherent, and yet those that general structure of philosophy can be used as an edifice to get into such toxic and insoluble matters, and essentially is used as just a kind of labeling system to get into the same kind of identity politics conflict, whereas essentially you're just looking at knowledge communities and epistemic communities, and then you're getting into the same kind of post-structural or you know the sort of the social constructive relativism sort of uh, uh, same old narrative, which is, as far as I can see, is fundamentally relativistic. Um, where are you judging between these community groups? It's sort of, it's talking about a kind of a static overview of how community groups it still tries to source a kind of universal code of ethics, which I can only describe as being somewhat positivistic in their, they're almost gainsayed into existence, and how they are. It's weird because they're taken as premises, but they're also taken as a kind of vision of a goal, of a teleos, and so under that kind of moral formulation, which becomes part of the rules of conduct in terms of how the matrix of knowledge communities come together, you get in that same kind of style of in identity politics. I mean, I call it de facto racial realism, because from the combination of I guess, yeah, I'm just trying to root this in pure abstract general philosophical terms. I think that, I mean, I can diagnose the problem as being the idea that epistemic injustice is something that's actually quantifiable when it is not. Epistemic injustice is a form of injustice which you can semantically, uh, it's not actionable. Epistemic injustice will never be actionable, and in some sense, it is a universal injustice, because it has to be countenanced when it is uncovered. It cannot be um, discharged. It cannot be fixed. It cannot be solved. Uh, there is no retributivistic reaction that can be applied to it. It cannot be remedied, because if it is epistemic injustice, then that's what it is. And it will never be anything else. It is not a source. It's not an untapped resource or something like that. It can't be leveraged to do something. And so the idea that you're going to translate epistemic injustice into some kind of creed of actionable arbitration, which judges what from where, um, something that's above all knowledge communities or something like that. I mean, it's, so it's strange that so much of the philosophy on the ground floor is so coherent, but then it gets into the same kind of metadrama or something like that. And what's worse is that there are many dark elements that go into this, but I mean, as far as I can see, this is a consistent intellectual quagmire that recurs in many different spheres, with the same kind of relativistic purview is being abrogated to the ideological proponents, and essentially, again, I mean, I would say it comes with I guess, some sense it's happening in terms of epistemic injustice, because uh, you're trying to translate some prescription, or some prescribed formulation of justice because the expectation is that it's meant to precipitate some kind of basis of morality and moral authority, which can be invoked or unmasked within a particular context or something like that. In some sense, it's just almost a semantic confusion around the word injustice, but that when you actually combine the word injustice with epistemic subject matter itself, the bound or the field of epistemic contents. I mean, it's a weird way in which, yeah, I do think it's something of a kind of mystification around the word injustice, which essentially, because people think that, okay, well, we've got one formulation of injustice, and now we've got another construction which involves the same word injustice, and so we've got two formulas which both contain the same term, and so therefore we can use those parts of that formula. It's the same thing that's happening in identity politics when they're going on about that race is socially constructed, and then they say that essentially reality itself is also socially constructed, and then de facto they kind of smudge these things together, and essentially through the magic of social constructivism, reality and race are determinant of each other, are completely causally correlated and reducible to each other, that reality and identity are both congruent productions of each other. And it comes in the worst way possible, because they never even attempt to falsify their own statistical table thumping, where essentially they develop aggregates of statistics of identity groups and certain outcomes, and that is taken to be evidence that race is socially constructed, where there's absolute and that becomes the sole causal explanation of anything, is just the identity. And in some sense, when you're talking about knowledge communities in the realm of Catherine Elgin, you're in that same confusion, where essentially you're not looking at tangible subjective intersection of interests or subject matter or something like that. You're looking at them somewhat beyond their own internal boundaries and or in terms of their knowledge community internal regulations and rules or whatever. You're not actually, you're trying to confront that some kind of hypothesized conflict between them in a disembodied, abstracted purview over looking at some kind of conflict between the knowledge communities but through some kind of weird fundamentally disorientated framework of some kind of mechanical thing in which somehow epistemic injustice is quantifiable and is is transcribable into some kind of actionable remedy or something like that. Because essentially that is the only context in which epistemic injustice is even conceivable, is within this kind of perspective that exists in no place that is the fundamentally, the kind of the paradox of relativism, trying to claim some kind of moral universal, principled, arbitration. Uh, it fundamentally forces to reduce experience down to some kind of common denominator between, um, things that are regarded also then to be separate and equal. Um, it's got this weird universal metric that it has to somewhat. Um, I mean, I think it even fails on that accounting as well. You know, the idea that epistemic injustice is fundamentally presumed to have a certain character and quality to it, which makes it amenable to being discharged or something like that. That is just because, I mean, they haven't even properly, in a functional sense, even substantiated how any of this can even work conceptually. They haven't even laid it out. But somehow there's this, they just invoke and insinuate that teleologically these things have to be important ingredients into some kind of, science of resolution, or something like that. And everything else is just a kind of work in progress, as it very embarrassingly tries to just kind of, um, they've got some formulations of it which are, frankly, they're just not good enough. They are really worthless. They're kind of like vague recipe cookbooking, sort of like how to prepare the ingredients. And we know that obviously there's going to be some kind of formulaic procedural method of getting all these things into, things in which, that everyone should be able to be rationally compellable to suffering the same, uh, uh, process of some kind of universal transcription, so that we can use this force of epistemic injustice to lord over some kind of, conflict resolution. Uh, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I would say that this general rationalistic sort of obsessive, uh, uh, control orientated, contemplative schema, it was probably first. Well, the first thing that I know about it is that these sorts of mechanisms, I think, we even just were the Stoics, I think, were of this same kind of rationalistic oversimplification. Um, anyway, I don't want to get down a rabbit hole, but, I mean, to me, it's interesting how essentially, I think the most elucidating aspect about this would be to actually look at it in pure psychological terms, because I see these kinds of ideologies as being. I always say that people that believe in this kind of ideology are functional, hybridized, histrionic personality disordered people, because their their sense of self, their sense of self conception, is so intermingled with this kind of abstract moral term. In identity politics, essentially, the identity and the self conception is such in, in, is such an inseparable subject matter or topic, um, that they become prone to the identity matrix as it is, uh, structured by the ideological prescriptions and edicts and vision for justice for the identity. And epistemic injustice, uh, would be quite the same. That you're part of this, token symbolic, um, accounting system in which your epistemic community, or knowledge community or knowledge group or whatever, is in the same, generalized conundrum and model of reality, and and then you've got this ideological device which essentially opens the window to this perspective which you are locked into. And this, I think, is analogous to the false self of the narcissist, or the split off material in the borderline personality disordered individual. Um, that the dissociative core that essentially insulates the true self and leads into conducting a whole procession of secondary and tertiary engagements in which one is using an invulnerable set of tactics to never retreat from this absolute God-eye point of view, purview, which I do think is the famous description of the problem of relativism, is that, like, what are you judging and from where? And essentially that is being hidden in this psychological schema, essentially, which I can only describe as being an ideological version. I mean, this is also why I think it leads to the same kind of fascistic conception of society. Obviously, it's much more dangerous than just merely merely having borderline personality disorder, because being part of a shared ideology means that essentially you can source collateral social validation and support to propel a kind of an orthodoxy which normalizes what I can only describe as a hybridized personality disorder, of a kind of cluster B style of presentation. Only it's not the adherent that is borderline. The identity is borderline, and they are merely using that shared cultural linchpin and social socially accepted set of tactics and defense mechanisms, which and I've got me talking about this, and I'd rather not repeat all of it, but essentially that to me makes them functionally hybridized histrionic, because and the it is more complicated than that, but anyway, I'm just going to move on now. What are the other things that I wanted to bring up? I mean, I'm just listening to a lecture by Sam Vaknin. I'm just going to say the name of the video. So it says, "Face to Face with Buried Traumas, Personality Disorders as Survival Adaptations." And so much of what he says is directly functionally analogous to what is happening intellectually with these ideologies. I mean, it is crazy. It's functionally exactly the same, but when it happens on a kind of collective level of politics and ideology, it's obviously not quite the same. In some sense, it can be worse as a kind of collective political animal. yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to go into the same arguments that I always make about how essentially how I go into describing it as proto-fascism. Um, I don't. Let me just get back to the other things that I wanted to get to. What did I say I wanted to get to? I wanted to get to commenting on. Yeah, okay. Let me. This is perhaps restating some of the points that I just made, but just in a nutshell, just to go into post-structuralism and social constructivism. Amounting to racial realism, essentially. No, I think I did actually cover that well enough. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I don't want to go through all that stuff that I usually go through, talking about how they're proto-fascist and how they share the same conception of society as fascists, and how actually let me read this out because it'll probably be better than me ranting. I wrote a very long article, or I wrote a very long response to an article. So this article, I don't know how long I want to take describing it because I'd rather just read my response, but it was something like the arrival of British settlers 200 years ago continues to cast a shadow over South Africa. And it just talks about things that happened. It doesn't talk about anything that happened sort of apart from very lightly mentioning how this these events like were precursors to apartheid or were the same pattern of apartheid or something like that. Um, and it doesn't describe anything about the present time. And one of the core things right at the start of this article, it says, but should South Africa celebrate or mourn their arrival and legacy? So should South Africa celebrate or mourn the arrival and legacy of the British settlers 200 years ago? That is the question that occurs, which ostensibly what the whole article is fundamentally about. But it doesn't seriously take that question into account. Well, anyway, let me just read my response. So I said, the style of this article is sickeningly biased and patently invested into the modern proclivity for identity consciousness and justice as defined by group categorization, with collective judgments and punishments promoted and endorsed by such putrid and flagrantly incendiary covert sadism, deploying aggregated generalizations that are embedded into historical descriptions that are framed by covert and dubious double standards. Then I quote their question, but should South Africa celebrate or mourn their arrival and legacy? Well, how about neither? And we just avoid the moral pontification over moot historical events, and avoid the cherry-picked survey that seeks to imagine some utopian counterfactual and then to leverage that unsubstantiated insinuation in order to embolden modern-day calls for social justice, which have been misquoted and misleadingly reframed from the Constitution itself, in the sickening racialist betrayal that is facilitated by a chorus of bandwagon-driven academics chasing after the limelight, who I can only hope will someday be sanctioned for the constitutional damages they have promoted and forwarded in the undermining of constitutional principles, through their resuscitation of disgusting theoretical structures such as race and gender and critical studies, which are philosophically identical to their historical cousin, Aryan studies, the only difference being in the substitute exploration of historical unnaturalism, filling in for the bunk of genetics and filling in for the bunk of genetics and ethnic Darwinism. Justice has just become the new adjective that has replaced the superiority espoused by the new and latest disguise of the fascistic worldview. So, some of my prose, I guess, is probably not so clearly fluid or whatever, but I think the thesis there, at least, is perhaps a slightly novel take on this, which is essentially what the Nazis would have regarded themselves as being superior and how they were infiltrated historically or something like that. We now have these people complaining about history constantly, and essentially their call for who has justice on their side is just a new way of saying that is the same claim that the Nazis were making, that they were fundamentally superior genetically. In order for me to properly dissect and debunk this biased style that this piece of racialist propaganda is written in, requires me to tread on the passive-aggressive traps which have been subtextually placed within the pathetic and pseudo-intellectual premises of expecting the system to precipitate equality for the identity under the naturalistic process of removing injustice, which has so much half-baked and fudge reductions of reality built into it, in brackets, a perfect conservation of historical injustice within the magic of reducing everything down to the same social constructivism, which gets aggregated out into identity generalization, being regarded as the sole determinant of outcome, as the sum product of history, M-identity reductionism, close brackets, so that if I were to try to argue or detract on the basis of the double standard of inquiry being pursued by the article, I would open myself to being labelled an injustice denier or simply a racist, for not joining in the yoke of this decadent and unconstitutional hijacking of the public sphere for the sake of this petty and retributivistic creed of short-sighted racial ideology, who are by my accounting proto-fascist ideologues who disguise their style of pandering to a reader that is expected to be hysterically driven into the arms of a paternalistic political interventionist, restructuring the system in order to bring justice down onto the identity. I will remind everyone that collective punishment is a war crime, and I do hope that one day real justice will be served of those who joined this bandwagon of constitutional betrayal and plutocratic facilitation of a racialist corruption of the law, which was only made possible by this kind of propaganda inseminating moral corruption. In order to aggregate identity and history into a common point of arbitration over systemic outcomes, which are presumed to be just as socially constructed as race is deemed to be, thus covertly applying a disgusting form of de facto racial realism from the point of view of policy, and this also indemnifying a form of unaccountable statecraft, always capable of diverting pressure in the same ideological core for more centralization and control over resources, fueled by its own failures and propelled from its own self-agonizing and self-fulfilling prophecies of racialist systemic self-sabotage. Essentially, by crafting policy that panders to identity, and essentially because it's fundamentally disruptive and it's not capable of intelligently applying resources towards uplifting those who have disadvantages, it can essentially facilitate corruption, and as that corruption creates a worse outcome overall for the most people, that can be used essentially to create more radical chauvinism that is targeted towards the identity, which still doesn't fix the problem ever. I'm saying that as an aside, as a comment on what I just said, but anyway. The question which I quoted from the article is never seriously taken on. No counterfactual explorations are made, nor is any serious treatment of history served by the patent fascistic conception of society that is applied onto the depraved reduction of history as it's blindly equated to the present time reality. Without, in brackets, without any serious inspection of the present predicament or admission of how the present predicament is totally unrelated to the implicit complaints being levied through mere buzzwords that are merely labeled into relevance, because they used really strange ideologically laden language. They use things like settler capitalism. It really, the whole thing, I don't want to read the article, but it's filled with just these virtue signals, essentially, just to try to make the past sound like how the social justice warrior people portray the present, as if, like, it's almost to create a false mythological history to embolden, it's to create this timeless moment, essentially, where we've always been living with the same problem. Anyway, I'm just going to move on with my article, but anyway, which continues to do the job of facilitating political unaccountability, shifting all blame from government onto history and identitarian targets. The level of unserious inspection enacted by this article would lead one to conclude reprehensible principles that fall into any fascistic wheelhouse. It outlines themes that are a disgusting fudge of sentiments like cultures are fundamentally separate and equal, that cultures cannot impinge on one another unless one is willing to adopt total historical guilt that can be freely offloaded onto them by the subjective claim of passivity, while moral standards are taken to be fundamentally relativistic and culturally bounded. No attempt is made at importing everyone onto the same moral dimension, only a disgusting juxtaposition of one group's ancestors versus another group's historical inheritors of the system's history, with no way to come to a joint point of mutual understanding or recognition. And I put in brackets, the progressive form of constitution and government and its self-sabotage is totally overlooked in terms of the present context. All merits of the modern system are left unspoken, implicitly repudiated as deficient, and through their silent expression it is assumed they can or must be imagined as only a blank space of new and radical possibility. Okay, I actually said radically possibility, and that was it was an editing mistake. Endorsing the idea of irresponsible burning of anything in the present which can be described as being historically similar, while also avoiding any political consciousness or political accountability for bridging any view into or from the present context. Imploring a convenient, relativistic and subjective interpretation of only one side's moral failings. Under the auspices of the mere appearance of any power asymmetry, means there is no nuance left for inspecting the merits and weaknesses in what is ostensibly being probed by this article, other than the naked orthodoxy of identity politics which is peddled by this deplorable article. It probably gets slightly wordy and slightly confusing near the end, but anyway, the gist probably gets through. Some of those phrasings were a bit clumsy, but yeah, when I'm talking about the mere appearance, I mean, anyway, basically, essentially more of the same racialist propaganda. I mean, to outline the basic double standard here is that it is actually very clearly stated in the article that essentially the colonialists, the settlers that came, disrupted a harmonious, community-orientated culture. And that is essentially the contrast, that essentially Westerners brought capitalism to South Africa and they were community orientated. So if if we didn't introduce settler capitalism, and the people were instead left to their utopian devices, that is the kind of counterfactual that has to be compensated for by some kind of collective guilt, which is essentially the looming question, which is underlined by this essentially race-baiting, disgusting question. But should South Africa celebrate or mourn their arrival and legacy, as if, you know, the false dichotomy that opens the door to the subtextual manipulation. And essentially getting in these very strange premises, just kind of subtextually, just littering the field with these very strange premises of contrasting alternative histories that never happened, but somehow the moral paradigm in which these contrasts are pertinent are exactly what is being described by this article. You know, it's as I've described before, I mean, it's de facto racial realism, essentially, in the same style as Aryan studies, and with a similar mythology. It's just substituting essentially some kind of ethnic Darwinism with some kind of historical unnaturalism. Okay. Anyway, I thought that there was a useful contribution to make. What else should I say? Oh yes. Okay. Now I want to talk about. I touched on this. I don't know if I uploaded this recording, but I made some recordings where I was talking about kind of some intellectual matters and things like that, and how to rhetorically combat identity politics. And it is very problematic because it's so convoluted in its own thinking, and it projects so much, and it's so anti-fragile and defensive that it's very hard to contest in real time. Because any resistance, it will kind of absorb in its strange kind of passivity. It will absorb this kind of narcissistic injury, and then it will essentially use that as an excuse to kind of sadistically debase you, you know, in some sense, and it you know, it justifies itself in being very threatening and such. You know, it has this kind of well, if you don't agree with me, then you give me the excuse to self-radicalize and to double down. It's quite virulent in that way. Anyway, I was talking in some of those recordings about I moved on to psychology, and I spoke about some things about the asymmetries between male and female borderline personality disordered individuals, and they are very interesting asymmetries. And to me, the most interesting difference between male and female presentations of borderline is what I would call the glasshouse defense. Is male borderlines in general, I think, are a little bit more, in as much as you can call anyone stable that has borderline personality disorder, male borderlines are more stable than female borderlines. And I think the they at the very least always appear to be more stable. And that is because a male borderline will not depend on the glasshouse defense. They will, as I've described before, so the glasshouse defense is essentially a the conspicuous display of vulnerability, of internal disarray. It is essentially to ask someone or to display to them internal disarray, and essentially to reveal that there is an internal war going on inside of the person, and essentially to use that internal disarray as a pacifier, as an environmental get out of jail free card, essentially. And male borderline personality disordered people can do very similar sorts of tactics, but they will have to justify them particularly in an environmental context which they have established already, or that they know has been established in their particular case. So essentially, a male borderline will do something that amounts to the same thing, but they will actually have to check to see that the legwork has been deployed to facilitate the use of that kind of tactic. They have to, and they are even responsive to to being pointed out that the requisites are not have not been established for their behavior, and they will even modulate their behavior. And in some sense, this at least forces male borderlines to be comprehensible on a rational level, which female borderlines don't have to conform to. Female borderlines can essentially, in some sense, I believe the only difference, I think what explains the difference between these behaviors is because there is a general societal trope or stereotype that women have a certain built-in status, and they have a certain built-in image that essentially is a fundamentally operative common point of shared knowledge that is already built in to the social environment. And so essentially women, once they learn that about culture or society, essentially facilitates them to just have a glasshouse defense. Whereas men never, or boys growing up, don't enjoy access to the same realization. So they can't essentially wire it into their tactical defense mechanisms. And that can also give you a clue as to the kind of level of maniacal plotting is actually happening on the level of the unconscious within these personality disorders. Anyway, the reason why I bring this up is actually because I want to make a political point. I do think that what actually defines the difference between a proto-fascist phase of culture and a full-on advent of fascistic expression and manifestation would be what I would call the male to female normalization of what would be in the political version of this personality disorder, cosmic moral authority that is dependable or relied on by the individual to permit yeah, sorry, this concept, I guess, is getting a bit too I should probably find another angle to describe it from. I'm losing myself. So I guess what I'm basically describing is that I think that, for example, the confidence in the sort of in the self-righteousness, or in the naturalistic sort of, and this is what a lot of these sort of academics are actually propounding and conjuring by trying to create the cultural facilitation and normalization of what I can only describe as histrionic and borderline values, and mechanisms of simplifying and generalizing life into convenient tokens and figures which are relatable to the feeling body, as it were, so that one can leverage manipulation and entrance or contract or entangle people into socially accepted sort of push-button deployment of sort of narratives and scripts which have been deemed by the orthodoxy as being essentially the valid translation of the complexity of reality and issues, that essentially people must all have a kind of reactionary switch in which that they must be made responsive to a complaint that you have against their identity, that essentially everyone must modulate their being to being relatable to this kind of queen bee conglomeration of having your feelings regulated by essentially a kind of codependence which is ideologically enforced, that you must secure the feeling state of people who you disagree with, that somehow to not be racist you must be conducive to somebody else's mental health, and their feeling of safety, essentially how political complaints are translated into this kind of the safety mechanism, which essentially is intellectually entrenched in this kind of translation of everything into history and identity. And so you have people that are being saddled with these projections of history and identity. And by a single person's subjective interpretation, somebody else is expected to perform and to discharge some kind of group obligation or something like that in order to fix the history. Through being forced to recognize that everything that they do is an animation of historical processes, so it's this weird kind of animism, and this weird kind of mythologized milieu of this kind of pervasive racialist cult. And if you talk about issues and problems that aren't reducible in those terms, then you are threatened or ostracized or there's only one program essentially, and it's even difficult to criticize the kind of the because the ideology fundamentally is so anti-fragile, it cannot be proven incorrect because it doesn't even try to substantiate any of its claims or premises. It just presumes them. Like, it just exists all in one go between its vision that identities must be made equal within the system and that identities are the product are the products of all social constructs, and so everything aggregates out into identity. Everything is summarized into identity, and so by definition, it is a total causal aggregation. And then essentially by the magic of statistical confabulation, which is not that different from narcissistic confabulation, essentially you get this selective reality and selective reference points, cherry-picked surveys, one-sided double standard, inconsistent methodology, essentially, because as long as the gist has the same ideological sort of slant, that's all that matters, is that there's conformity in essentially making space for a kind of mediator over identity, that is the way to fix everything. And anyone that stands up in that process, in that sausage-making process, essentially, you're standing in the way of the beloved Führer who will bring who will bring salvation to the identity matrix, who will be the savior of the identity. That is exactly how this culture functions. Which is interesting because that is exactly also how borderlines generally entreat their targets that they become codependent with, is that they first put them up on a pedestal and then they essentially decompartmentalize them and with certain constructed envelopes of disorientation, hoping to force their victim or their host to absorb the dissonance and absorb the chorus of hysterical, conflicting, emotional, dysregulated desires and expectations and anticipations, which they have no interest in regulating themselves, which they have no incentive. In fact, they will always even overtly complain that they don't have an incentive. They want to be given an incentive why they should do anything differently, because what they're doing you know, essentially they've got this kind of this unassailable and nebulous kind of perfection, which essentially would have been unassailable but for some fly in their ointment, or some interaction that has left them worse off, and they want somebody else essentially to give them the best of all possible universes, to deliver to them some kind of hidden compartment of excavated, you know, they deserve some kind of windfall, they deserve some kind of enforced slavery. Frankly, that is what they demand, is essentially for their perceived losses. They want someone to compensate them. And they'll destroy that person in the process, because I mean that's part of the formulation. It's part of the codependent mechanism that they use. Because of essentially the nature of the decompartmentalization, which is how they communicate and how they regulate their own internal disarray, by getting somebody else's feeling body to absorb and to process, and so that somebody else can fuel the administration of their affairs with their ego function, and essentially they can just continue to be children, essentially. I mean, this is often why a borderline, for instance, will just quite sometimes they will seem to be just completely chaotic, that they will go through a series of behavior which will seem to have absolutely no pattern, no coherence. It'll just be erratic. It'll just be utter disruption as well to the people around them. And this is effectively a call, a signal that is meant to attract some force that will provide some kind of command value over them, because when there is a command value, then they can start to manipulate a thread of drama. They can start to create a history which they can start to deploy and selectively tailor and selectively duplicate and usually in an inconsistent and even irrational way. But if they can get somebody to absorb that, if they can get that person to absorb that irrationality and to essentially disorientate themselves in relation to their own, let's say, historical relationship, you eventually get to the house of what I refer to as the house of mirrors, but which is essentially the goal of any fascistic society, tries to essentially create the house of mirrors. I would say in the political fascistic conception, the house of mirrors would look something like Hitler's dream that that all nations are alike relative to themselves, where they are fundamentally kind of competing against the other nations, completely insulated and isolated, and essentially in their own little bubble universe. But they're all the same, but they're all different. And in some sense, I guess it is slightly different from the House of Mirrors, because in the House of Mirrors there's this sense in which one sees a reflection of oneself in other. Okay, this is getting into a disparate sort of topic, but anyway, let me just fix, I guess, my analogy. So the House of Mirrors, how it actually operates in terms of a borderline, what they want to actually get to is the point in which that they can actually do a role reversal, where they take on essentially the identity of the other person. And also what they do is they take the identity of the other person and they shatter it like a mirror, and then they use pieces of that reflection, they use pieces of that mirror to fill in conveniently, because the House of Mirrors is also filled with murky smoke, and that essentially they can use somebody else's integrity and somebody else's character effectively to excuse and explain the lack of something. So and they can do two things. Essentially, they can do a completely role reversal, where they can impute all of their actions as being reaction to the other person. So in some sense, all the bad things that they ever did were just caused by the other person. And so essentially they can use the other person as just a complete scapegoat, but also they can actually, it happens over a long period of time, but they can actually get the other person to mimic the borderline, and the borderline will actually mimic them as a kind of trade-off. And they will actually do a complete role reversal. And it's very spooky, essentially, but it's almost like body swapping. But essentially, they can only be comfortable body swapping if they have essentially complete control over the shared units that they have become. Essentially, they have become completely hybridized in terms of the borderline taking on the host's feeling body and somewhat sharing in the administration, but using the host as a kind of, as a way to fix any problem, essentially, because the only way that they would be comfortable enough to do a role reversal is if they knew that they weren't responsible for anything going wrong, that if anything did go wrong, they could just essentially fob it off on the other party. So they need the other person around as a persistent sponge for any negative effect, essentially. And once they have that power, then that gives them the confidence to do a kind of role reversal. But it only happens, essentially, I mean, in identity politics terms, this would be the good ally. So these people are actually creating these functional units, which are, I would call them proto-fascist. That they have the fascistic conception of society. They have the fascistic interpretation of reality. Even they have the same even mythology as fascism, just in slightly different labels and terms. It's not. You can't actually run a state like this. You can think that you're intellectual like this, and in some sense, this mirrors the kind of consciousness that existed during the Nuremberg rallies in the late period of the Weimar Republic. This is the same kind of progressivism and the same kind of of this idea that if we just had someone who would deliver identity, justice to our identity, that would be a better political arrangement, essentially. But essentially, once you get you can't run a state like this. You can run a culture like this, but you can't run a state like this. And so if you give these people political power, the whole thing breaks down. It doesn't work on the level of a state bureaucracy and policy. It just fundamentally doesn't work. And in fact, the only way to get it to work in some way is to become more and more totalitarian and authoritarian and more stark in the instantiation of the cultural values into policy, because it's such destructive, disruptive, destabilizing policy that strips a culture of its kind of meritocracy. It strips a culture of being able to be, well, in terms of the political management. It stops people from being able to arrange things efficiently or effectively, because things have to be done because of superficial factors. They can't be done based on merit. So it fundamentally removes principle from the effective sphere of management. So essentially, I mean, this is why it's so prone to political corruption, because you are giving something based on the token of their representation of the identity. It's not because they have a disadvantage, it's because the identity is fundamentally disadvantaged. So it doesn't matter if you give it to a plutocratic black elite that's politically connected. There's no, the ideology doesn't differentiate between poor and rich. It just sees color. It just sees the one ring to rule them all. The kind of and just like the one ring, it makes one invisible. It makes one's actions unaccountable and unassailable. You become the hidden hand. And you become expected to massage reality and to tailor reality and to manage things, like in a Gestapo type fashion, to keep the narrative rolling forward, to keep the vision being unfolded. Anyway, so essentially, in the proto-fascist worldview, I think that they do actually see the House of Mirrors as being the kind of the target zone as to how healing will occur, instead of actually just a very convoluted, putrid, unsustainable cultural mass of disorientating and delusional. I mean, the Nazis were a perfect example of this. Their culture was so pathetic. I bet you could measure on a chart the loss of IQ points in the. I mean, we're experiencing the same thing today with this identity politics mania. The news media fundamentally can only address people as a kind of hysterical mob that is only moved by anxiousness and fear. They are pandered to, and in fact, because the news media frames their audience in such deplorable and disgusting, kind of reprehensible things. They don't treat their audiences like people that deserve to be politically informed and that are accountable for their own political consciousnesses, as if they cannot be trusted with hearing two sides of a story. They can only be told things according to a single orthodox narrative. They can only be peddled a certain opinion where their feelings are presumed. Their reactive feelings are just absolutely implicitly narrated to them about how they're supposed to feel about a story. There's a cherry-picked and selective tailoring of the information. There's never a real substantive counter-argument being made. It's just character assassination, essentially. The COVID-19 coverage is a perfect example of this. And it's disgusting on multiple fronts. But I mean, democracy can't function when you have journalism that is so fundamentally rotten. And in some sense, because journalism keeps on addressing their consumers in the same frame of reference, in the same expectation of their audience, politicians are forced essentially to pander to how journalists frame reality and how weakly they interrogate reality. So because journalists don't do their job of sense-making and interrogation of reality, politicians merely have to put up with this not unnuanced, unsophisticated interrogation of reality, and they can just they have to just imagine the most simplistic reaction to any news event, and that is how they have to essentially manage their political economy, because they can't trust the public, because the public is framed constantly by journalists as essentially being animalistic in their anxious sentimentality. I mean, I would say that journalism has radicalized itself because it has been influenced by its own deployment of being essentially the propaganda wing for identity politics. It has for too long learnt how to tailor the narrative and use false dichotomies and to force oversimplified generalizations of issues to make identity politics palpable, or palatable, should I say. They have framed identity politics as being essentially the only correct form of political thought for so long that it has stultified and stupefied their framing of the news, that essentially we don't even have a functioning democracy anymore. And I do think that we can blame politicians, but we must also blame journalists before we blame politicians. Because without without a functioning organ of news media, of sense making, democracy can't function, and so it doesn't. And again, I guess we can also trace that to academia, because it was the departments of journalism, essentially, that I think has precipitated this cult of well-placed tactically deployed they have enough sort of institutional credentials and power, essentially, that they have managed to completely circumvent the structure of the Constitution and its non-racialist character. They have, effectively, the question is can the Constitution be revived? Can it be resuscitated? Because it is dead. It is functionally dead. The rule of law has been given over to this toxic culture and politics of racialist self-sabotage that is so toxic that it has it compels people to have to make excuses for its failings, and kind of get into this economy, this political economy of vulnerable narcissism. That's how it kind of grows, by its own decadent I just remembered the last topic that I wanted to get into, and this is pure psychology now. So in some of my theoretical models of personality, I still believe that perhaps the answer is not to completely dissolve the false ego complex, that in some sense what would actually be the resolution of the false ego is to be able to fluidly cycle through it and to be able to articulate the false ego in such a wise that it is almost within its own internal schema, that it is fluidly variable. And I think I've uncovered an element in thinking more about the superego. The superego has always eluded me in terms of defining it very keenly, because I have a good theoretical sort of description of how it relates to the unconscious, the subconscious. I mean, I have multiple theoretical models. The superego is fundamentally mysterious in relation to the other three sides of the mind, because ontologically it occurred before the others. And it's easiest for me to understand it when I consider all four sides of the mind together, or three sides of the mind and it separately. But what I haven't properly considered is how it looks from the three sides of the mind back to it, and back to the superego. How I guess I haven't fully understood exactly how it should be defined in that conjoined context. And I think the answer is quite simple. And I mean, I thought about this when I heard Sam Vaknin give a description of the superego, and he said that the superego in, let's say, the neurotypical person is, or an ordinary person, essentially facilitates the contrast between the ideal ego and the actual ego. And that got me thinking that, I mean, my definition of the superego has just generally been I mean, I've generally conceived of it as a kind of environmental consciousness that has a kind of that even existed before there was a self-concept. In some sense, it represents that stage that is before animism. Is that what it's called? I'm trying to refer to what's it called. Yeah, no, I think it is called animism. We're essentially where, no, I'm probably getting their name wrong. I always forget these sorts of things, but was it Malcolm that came up with, the when you differentiate, it's I link this in my models with when language starts to develop and you start to develop a subconscious, because it's the knowledge of the knowledge of independent motion. It's like the knowledge of a persistent environmental context. Is when the infant starts to break away from what do you call it? Object impermanency and that sort of stuff, but I can't remember how it's actually theoretically described by, I can't remember what his name was, Malcolm, I think. Anyway, I can't remember actually what my speech is on that, but I in my model, animism is something like a structure, a modeled structure of verb. It's like it's categorization of verbs into a generalistic structure. Something like that. Anyway, this is what am I coming to? Anyway, the because that is actually that is the matrix that makes up the that is the substructure of the subconscious, because without that you don't have point designations to which to attach identities of relational contraction. Sorry, this sounds a bit verbose, but essentially, without that substructure, you can't have feelings about objects, because you don't know enough about because if you don't have a constancy and a consistency of relational regularity, you can't feel things about objects. And I mean, when I say objects, I mean in terms of mental objects. You don't have, first of all, you won't have stable mental constructs, and then you won't have enough of, let's say, background knowledge in which those constructs can be modulated, into which that you can attach modal values, which would be like feelings about them. So that is essentially is the fundamental substructure of the subconscious. But and I believe that that's what Malcolm, if I got his name right, is essentially describing when he's talking about animism. But anyway, what I want to get to is that the superego, my new thinking now of way of defining the superego, in the context of trying to come up with a solution, a general solution of somewhat of self-actualization within the context of the false ego, or a kind of pinnacle state of how to resolve problems within the false ego, is essentially the pathology of the false ego is when you're generally when you're stuck within a certain configuration of recurring impediments in which you're stuck on either an unconscious subversion, which you're doing to your own ego function, because your subconscious is fundamentally sort of, let's say, plagued with cognitive dissonance. Um, and so there's functionally there's a computation which is never being executed. And so the form that the false ego takes is fundamentally transfixed into a particular style, and that recurring style becomes someone's personality, their persistent personality style, or pattern of behavior and cognitive behavior. And essentially, I do think that one of the biggest ways of reorientating a fluid expression of, let's say, a non-pathological ego or false ego complex or something like that. So to call it a false ego complex already sounds implicitly pathological, so maybe I'll have to think of a different term for it. But I think that essentially the way to, or let me say rather, the way to escape the false ego is that I believe that the superego actually does have the power to change the contents of the other sides of the mind. And I was even thinking that a therapeutic measure might be to inhabit the superego perspective and to import elements of the other sides of the mind into the superego perspective. And in some sense to break the mold of the superego, which is constraining and structuring the sympathetic circuitry which makes up the false ego complex. So not even using my own approximation, using somebody else's approximation and not even my own, which I would describe as a more accurate model of the four sides of the mind. An INTJ superego is supposedly an ISF. ISFJ. Yeah, it's an ISFJ. And that might be actually the way to very quickly unravel and gain far-reaching perspective against one's own proclivities that are embedded within the structure of one's common or habitual false ego complex. And so the abrogation of, let's say, differing perspectives from one's native superego perspective might be the way to actually crack out of the false ego complex. Yeah, okay, I just repeated myself. But let me say that, define the superego perspective. So I think that the superego perspective is actually just looking at the other sides of the mind, just looking at the three other sides of the mind. I think in some sense, if you I mean, I can do it because I'm familiar with my own models, I guess, but if you can observe the mind operating and you have distinguished between the distinct operations of the ego function, the subconscious and the unconscious, then fundamentally, when you are observing those things, you are observing them from the perspective of the superego. And the superego, by requisite, is in a certain a certain cognitive circuitry which precipitates and allows for that to occur, although normally it will actually have problems um, with different sides of the mind differently. most prominently, it will have, well, actually it has a unique relationship with all three. It has a very different relationship with all three sides of the mind. But that, I think, is the end game. And I think the interesting end game of where real development and growth occurs is when the superego is integrating functions which effectively displace the functioning of the sides of the mind and force them to be adapted or to be augmented. And through the process of that augmentation, and I think as long as it's fluid, I might be able to come up with a more procedural, therapeutic intervention, because it might be almost like a feng shui sort of thing. Within my model of emotional tones, some tones are fundamentally counter-offers to other tones. And so the tone which could be seen as the embedded seed of the entire false ego complex, if that were almost massaged into being displaced by essentially its antithetical proposition, it might force a cascade of perspective which would facilitate let me try to think of something poetic to say, a kind of an agile propitiatory mechanism to radically clearing up, let's say, the whatever lingering cognitive dissonance might exist, but also the fundamental disunity, which I think is almost, in some sense, the weakest part of the entire false ego complex is the subconscious, because the subconscious is indulged in by the ego function in order to escape its own arduous reflective procedure, which essentially it's just the bagman for the unconscious side of the mind. And the unconscious side of the mind is preemptively anxious at essentially being plagued by its own miscalibrated lever pulling as the architect essentially of the ship, because it doesn't know how it's going to be revisited by the consequences of its from the captain of the ship, which is the ego function. And essentially the crew, which have to maintain the ship according to the specs of the architect, but have to follow the orders of the captain, are in this double bind, which creates a certain unspoken miscommunication between the captain and the architect, which plays itself out in the imprecision of the crew, of the subconscious in this analogy. And so there are lots of unpacked contradictions, and if they were just all entirely augmented, if all of these roles were entirely augmented, in fact, if you could, in some sense, completely do a role reversal of the current configuration of cognitive functions which make up the unconscious side of the mind and which make up the ego side of the mind, and you almost flip those, that perhaps perhaps that's actually the wrong thing. Maybe you need to sort of invert some of them and keep another set of them. But maybe the point is that there might be a more efficient, let's say, clearinghouse method to sort of picking up all the flies in the ointment, or all the demons. But anyway, this in some sense this might also facilitate going back essentially to fundamentally a seat of consciousness which is fundamentally rooted primarily in the superego, and essentially the superego is interesting. I haven't thought about it, how all of life could be restructured under the rubric of a kind of superego consciousness. It is actually, I think that might be the solution. And in some sense, the other three sides of the mind are a plausible projection, but they're not. In some sense, they're just postulated as existing. They have no existence other than the postulation that is occurring from within the bounds of the superego itself. Anyway, my voice is growing tired. I guess, yeah, that's going to be the end of this recording and my speculation. I'm always slightly upset with myself that I can't seem to produce an utterly clear refutation of the shenanigans and the trickery that is going on in, this depraved social philosophy of interpretation of society that comes from essentially identity politics and the general slew of academic thought that has joined this bandwagon. I'm going to try to get into the technical issues, which again I'm embarrassed that I can't really produce an utterly clear diagnosis upon. Part of this is because of the statistical nature of the technical problem. In some sense, is very relatable to the prosecutor's fallacy in statistics. And one of the problems with actually trying to explain that when it is being done through a kind of philosophical convoluting of issues is because there's not one way to debunk it. There are multiple ways of deconstructing how it fundamentally is making illegitimate moves. The problem is that there's so many ways of doing that, it's hard to follow. It's so I can come up with a formulation that kind of shows the absurdity and the incoherence and the fundamentally almost cherry-picked tentative false dilemma that is being foisted onto the audience of this trickery, but it's not the only way of interpreting it, and so it is slightly hard to follow. Also, in some sense, it does plague. It does proceed from a particular plague that has existed within logical thinking, which it preys on a particular error to do with the axiom of transitivity, the logical axiom of transitivity, that it is using transitivity, which is a there is material out there. I think there's a very good podcast in the Philosophy Bites podcast called On Transitivity by I can't remember the name of the professor that gave that lecture, that basically just poses some very serious doubts about the axiom of transitivity. But essentially, how I would technically frame the problem of transitivity. Transitivity is simply the kind of thing where you say, if you are dealing with, for example, transitivity within equalities, that like if A equals B and B equals C, therefore, because of the axiom of transitivity, A equals C. That's that, and you can do the same thing with greater than and equal to. The idea is essentially is that there's a kind of universal congruence that gets conserved within these moves. The real problem with transitivity, and this is a kind of a nuanced kind of problem, is the word if. And so the first line is if A equals B, and the second line is and B equals C. So these conditions do not support the axiom of transitivity. They're not enough. You actually need to have more conditions, and the condition which is not specified is essentially something like the term only. You can't just say and. You have to say and only this as well. And as soon as you have to add another condition of only, the problem is that like essentially the only is kind of like the presumptive thing that transitivity was supposed to kind of conserve in the first place. That only is a kind of it gets, because now to talk about this intelligently, I have to kind of invent more terms and kind of try to make distinctions about things that are functionally hypothetical. But in some sense, that's the point, is that there's a secret idea that any kind of hypothetical condition that would make it not true, but that could operate without negating the and anything almost can operate without negating the and. Essentially the problem is that like it can't just be and. It has to be something like and only and. It has to say something like that. But then what does only even mean? Well, only is the thing that underwrites or guarantees the transitive validity or something like that, or that validates that rule of transitivity or something like that. And so in essence, it's it's almost like it's begging its own question to a large degree, and it fundamentally doesn't work. I mean, this really has to do with in, for example, Jungian psychology, introverted thinking and introverted feeling, and the age-old confusion that has happened in when people define these cognitive functions. They have gotten into the same kind of toxic philosophical problem, where essentially introverted feeling is often defined as a judgment of good and bad, and introverted thinking is defined as a judgment of correct and incorrect, or true or false. And so it has generally been conceived of that judgments of good and bad and judgments of true and false are quite there's almost a symmetry between introverted feeling and introverted thinking, and they operate in quite the same way. That's not actually true. Introverted thinking is a much more contextually bound proposition. It's more correct to say essentially that introverted thinking is a test of self-consistency and self-incongruence in some sense. So it can't test if something is true or false. It can only test if something is self-consistent or not. So the introverted thinking judgment is just, is something self-consistent or is something not self-consistent? And in some sense, that means that transitivity itself is the fake and the false axiom that is being leveraged in order to essentially erect a kind of universal matrix of the Stoics had this sort of rationality, sort of cultism embedded into their philosophy as well, that essentially you, in the integrity of your culturally bound existence, in which you're maximizing for almost your socially relative, it's got this weird kind of metropolitan sort of ethos in Stoicism, and it essentially affirms itself in doing that because it tells itself that it is doing what is true, and it never has to, and it conflates that sort of that TI conception of truth, or rather than saying, oh well, I'm just being self-consistent, and actually I still need a higher, let's say almost spiritual or verified psyche in terms of some greater philosophical edifice or structural framework. It's sort of, it puts that issue away because it kind of says, well, I'm just part of this kind of universal cosmic justice in some sense. Where you're just optimizing for some kind of rationalized, commodified material of truthiness, which is interesting as well, because I would say that amounts to a formulaic ethos of a kind of truth conduciveness, which I would have expected epistemological pragmatists, or more specifically epistemological responsibilists, or responsibilism, epistemic responsibilism, to not fall into that meta trap, which essentially I believe it has done when it comes to the topic of epistemic communities and knowledge communities, and anyway, I'm going to get into that. So let me take a step back. And in some sense, this comes from essentially looking at your situation as a universal case, and therefore believing that you have a kind of disembodied purview over it, a kind of God's eye point of view. It's quite abstracted. And when you are viewing yourself like this, you can only see yourself as true in doing that if your essential idea of truth matches up to this kind of universal, rationalistic, quantitative matrix, essentially, which gives you sort of this statistical overview in some sense, because you've actually turned that objectified realm, which I think is plagued fundamentally almost by the problem of relativism, because like, where are you even judging it from? This disembodied, fundamentally dehumanized context in some sense, that is just supposedly supported by some kind of logical, conjecture in some sense, some kind of hypothetical medium of a kind of universal metric that is equated vaguely into this property of truth, instead of just saying, okay, no, actually, this is just the formulaic representation of self-consistency, and that whole paradigm is not one that can be emulated in the mind. It's not worthy to be to even be considered. One just can just interpret it quite simply as saying, okay, well, this is a case of self-consistency, and let's say it's a basic test to know that essentially you're in something that's capable of maintaining itself, reproducing itself in terms of its kind of its principal structure. Essentially the utility of self-consistency is merely to kind of escape from one's from some form of perhaps surreptitious self-contradiction. So in some sense, it's a pure test of rationality. It's not a test of truthfulness. A test of a kind of internal rationality. And it also binds rationality in that kind of humble context, that there is no, in essence, supreme rationality, which is ironically what is actually being forwarded within these kinds of schemas that pretend to look at the system from this disembodied point of view. Okay, I'm just repeating myself, but let me move back into the issues. And this is actually a common intellectual trope, even, and this existed before this kind of what I would just call as a kind of pseudo-intellectualism, because it's almost, it always takes on the same pattern, and it's disgusting to watch, because it's always the same kind of pseudo-intellectualism, where you have people essentially almost projecting a polemic onto someone, and then imagining them playing a role in your polemic, and then kind of strawmanning their position implicitly, and sort of interrupting them and putting words in their mouth to a large extent to fulfill the kind of polemic that's being projected onto them, and then forcing them essentially to have to negate a whole class of accusations, a whole class of claims, in order to defeat your ought perspective. That in some sense it does this weird trick where it's representing a kind of teleological outlook in terms of what ought to be true, and somebody else is merely has this huge burden of proof almost to defeat the conjecture and the speculation that supports this ought in every conceivable case, because otherwise the generalization, which is a kind of reduction which facilitates the which facilitates the deployment of that supposed universal cosmic justice rationality. It has this very disgusting kind of specious burden of proof that it dictates and administers over its agreements. It is a very okay. Let me get into better technical specifics, otherwise this just starts sounding very bad. Yeah, let me look at my notes. Okay, so the problem is that it fundamentally creates what I would call a hypothetical metric in terms of this kind of cosmic rationality of justice or something like that, because it's just taken to be as a sign of truth. So one instantiation of the use of transitivity, which essentially creates this giant hypothetical matrix of a kind of universal rationality, when one person is inhabiting that psychologically in the terms of their schema, then essentially they end up essentially projecting a kind of polemic onto people. But that hypothetical matrix and metric that is being leveraged against interlocutors is within itself a kind of a vague reliance on some transitive correlation. And so they can use that transitive correlation essentially as the hard wedge of the kind of one of the universal lattices, or one of the, it's a part of this universal rational system or something like that. So they, this I believe is actually at the spiritual heart, to use a metaphor, of the kind of positivistic moralism and legal positivism as well. The positivistic worldview really is the idea that you can know some specialized segmented part of the rational universe, and that is a guaranteed building block, that is a kind of part of the spiderweb lattice that is connected to everything else. And so even though we don't know everything else, we can sort of be certain about this because it is a part of the introverted thinking truth. It is part of the universal rational matrix. And so it is one of the bricks in the wall, as it were. And so this so when they are defending, and this is, essentially they then get to play the kind of the bucket fishing that any kind of Stoic can also do within their own, fortified psychological schema, where they just have to defend themselves by proving how rational they're being and how irrational other people are being if they try to contradict the Stoic. Because all the terms that they use have been vetted as having these kinds of these fixed interrelated, and the only thing that they can be wrong at is if they've made a kind of if they've made the wrong opinion about what is going on. So the only argumentation which they can engage in is not a question of ought, but a question of is their reading of the situation applicable in some sense. And so you have to defeat their reduction. You have to defeat their generalization. And essentially then they are open to just using speculation and conjecture and cherry-pick data, and to not question and to use double standards of interrogation, of evidence. And it's fine because it's all in support of their oversimplification of what is true. of what ought to be true in terms of, and that being a case of what is true in the moral paradigm, perhaps, which is all packed into the polemic that is being projected onto people, using the hard wedge of some basic reduction. And so, if you try to if you try to dismantle that reduction, then you get labeled with, these labels of sort of cosmic justice against you. That you're disrupting their religious cosmic I think identity politics is even a special case of this, because it's it's so pathological. It's actually ridiculous just how stupefying it is, just how fundamentally morally corrupt it is. You only have to think about philosophically, implicitly, the moves that are being made, and how it is essentially disguising its own disgusting form of relativism, and how dishonestly it deploys its pseudo-intellectual arguments, which, essentially, the only way I see it getting away with it, essentially, is that, well, it's part of a culturally successful bandwagon. It's it has so much popularity that somehow that makes up for its specific non-substantive or unsubstantiated structure. It doesn't have a functioning philosophical edifice. It's still being worked out. It's ridiculous. And somehow it gets away with all of this, just because it's popular or something, just because it has the currency of kind of cultural buzzwords, and how it's basically taken over, in some sense, journalism, and how it's strategically held all the kind of credentialed institutional power in society. And in essence, it functions because it's so intellectually brittle, and it's so intellectually incapable of substantiating its own claims, that it can only function essentially by this weird form of undemocratic bullying, and its almost collapse of the public sphere and political consciousness into essentially conforming with its orthodoxy and being responsive to its kind of race baiting or false dilemmas, or its sort of cherry picked surveys of intellectual matters. It almost it postures its weaknesses as just continuing to elaborate one small point before moving on to another general theme that I think is important, that was actually another point that I didn't properly attend to when I brought it up, is essentially how the secondary economy, which essentially is this kind of this defensive rationalization, which has to grow and seek further alignment with the whole sort of matrix of secondary rationales that support the cosmic justice claim being made. And so the kind of the need for a kind of factual alignment that is conducive to the teleological position. Just to try and make an abstract or broad, a general claim about this, in the same example that I gave, in which, Kantian deontologists will create institutions to guarantee the categorical imperative, and then those institutions will have their own codes and rationales, and that have to be justified within some kind of utilitarian, kind of prospective, formulaic, or heuristic reduction of how they're going to guarantee the categorical imperative. And essentially they do that by everything else other than just applying the categorical imperative directly. And so you get this kind of this ulterior translation or transcription of the moral code into a kind of into some kind of positivistic order, which continues to require a rationalistic alignment with its heuristics and sort of and it's weird that I guess I'm not describing this so perfectly, but it gets into weird things when you work out that essentially in the kinds of arguments that are being made, there's just this kind of arena of confabulation where everything gets conflated into the same moral substance, or everything gets transcribed into the same medium. And I mean, it's a bit like a house of cards, and it's a bit like a sort of it's quite a brittle structure, but and this requires then from people a kind of rationalistic compliance to these threads of epistemic conduciveness. Where it's judging these features from this disembodied point of view that exists beyond them, and essentially just depends on some kind of pure rationalism, or universal rationalism rather, which to me is somewhat emblematic of how this is all hinged on transitivity. But it doesn't take the caveats that I placed on the problem of transitivity seriously, that the problem with transitivity is the and statement has to be further qualified with an and only, and only and that only itself makes the whole feature of transitivity somewhat of a contrivance, of a weird sort of I mean, it's certainly not axiomatic. It's almost like an inductive conjecture, which one just fudges everything in order to sustain. Okay, now this is getting a bit too esoteric, but anyway, I was just trying to. I guess I wanted to elaborate on the point in which how, for example, identity kind of seeps into the conception of time itself. That essentially the only way, for example, in the conceptualization of identity politics and history and the present, that essentially the medium of time itself, the medium of history itself, becomes a kind of generalized into epochs that are reduced down into caricatures of just the most cartoonish, kind of reduction of reality into the simplistic identity dramatization. And you really have to believe that reduction is the valid summary, an aggregate of history, or something like that. It's the level of cherry pick surveying of reality, and I mean the kind of it's almost is I would call it delusional, to be willing to filter reality to such an extent where you get this stable narrative that is so grossly simplified in these disgusting generalizations, as if the complexity of human interactions You know, I mean, yeah, it's to put a filter on history that is just, you know, it's not, it's mythology at that point. You know, it's mythology in purpose of a particular racialist creed, essentially, of a spiritual basis of some kind of fascist culture. Um, that people are learning the genealogy of their identity in the same ways that the Aryans were learning about the genealogy of their ethnicity. Um, anyway, okay, this is a repeated point, but the thing that I wanted to kind of, which I touched on slightly, and it's kind of lost here because I haven't properly given the kind of the psychological analogy, which I have laid out in other recordings. Um, when I talk about I can't remember what I ended up saying. I mean, I ended up saying that the ideology functions like borderline personality disorder, but the ideological adherent, the identitarian adherent, um, the proponent of identity politics, is what I would call the functional histrionic. And histrionics, in some sense, uh, do quite well in a kind of cohort that involves a borderline, because the borderlines create enough of a kind of decompartmentalization from reality, um, that it makes people prone to being bullied, essentially, by this style of uh, uh, reality disorientation. You know, it sort of it facilitates a culture of tactics which are free game, that are just permitted to be deployed and utilized and leveraged against people. And so borderlines create a kind of a safe climate, a safe culture in which histrionics can go somewhat unnoticed, and permitted. It creates the kind of brittle intellectual atmosphere, um, in which you can do the kind of pseudo intellectualism that I was just describing. Yeah, I do think that to a large extent, histrionic tendencies and defense mechanisms um, were probably always a significant portion of the population. Obviously, we all suffer collectively much worse when it becomes the kind of the cultural hegemon. Um, uh, anyway, I was trying to make a following on from the more detailed descriptions that I have gone into about this in the past, that essentially the great switch that we see, which we still haven't seen yet, which is what I would describe what happens when you go from a proto-fascist culture into a full-blown fascist culture, is essentially when the male borderline um, uh, valence, and I'm just yeah, let me just try to reference this too. So I mean, I try to explain that in the ideology there is a gender in the ideology, that they are essentially these queen bees, these field marshals that kind of contain the bubble reality by essentially um, being the focal point of a kind of mini house of mirrors. They are the local Führer, essentially. They are the local Grand Dragon Vizier, you know, like in the KKK. Um, they are the kind of the cultural linchpin of their immediate circle. And then they have what I would call like the male borderline component, which and when I say male borderline here, I don't mean that people are it's not when I'm talking about the pure personality disorder of someone who has borderline and is male. I'm talking about uh, the male borderline component would be like the codependent target of the of any borderline. So yeah, so I mean, to just gender those roles, because it's a good it's a pretty decent archetype that because I mean, it also happens that by far the most people with borderline personality disorder are female. That they need somebody else's feeling body to attach onto, and the male component of their modus operandi is there to host their unconscious mind, essentially. Um, and I made this whole very elaborate example of how ideologically that is what happens as well when you have these passive intellectuals that are essentially trying to rationalize the sentiments that are voiced by the female component that is expressing her sentiments, her unconscious desires, her unconscious tensions, and even the disparate, kind of uh, uh, I mean the biggest problem with borderline essentially is that they have inconsistent demands and expectations, where it's not possible to actually cater and pander to them because what they demand is fundamentally incommensurate. And in some sense, I believe that this is even partly by design. I mean, it's no surprise that borderline has been finally uncovered to be a manifestation of a secondary psychopathy. That I mean, I would also say that this is also pretty obvious in how they don't start off with this. They do it on a gradient scale. They decompartmentalize their hosts in order to break them down into such a state into which that they can actually usually generate a stable house of mirrors, where they disintegrate the identity and the integrity of the other person, and they use it essentially to buttress the holes in their narrative, that essentially they just use them as a kind of disposable scapegoat. And ideologically, this is what happens with the male component of the ideology, is that these people are just there to generate their pseudo-intellectual passive rationalizations of the action which is directed by the female borderline component. Now, borderline is generally a feminine sort of thing as well. Okay, so now I'm just contrasting that entirely against what I would describe as male borderline. Now, actual individuals that are male that have the personality disorder, I've tried to describe the only asymmetry between male and female is that a male borderline does not use the glass house defense. And because they don't use the glass house defense, they can only use that defensive tactic if it is particularly orchestrated and set up by tailoring the narrative. So they actually have to import a concrete cultural edifice that stabilizes the male borderline role. I mean, male borderlines in general, I believe, are more just in general, they're more high functioning, because they know that they can't just use the glass house defense. They have to have a particular they have to particularly leverage a social construct and know and see that it is applicable to the people that are viewing them in a particular context, and they have to keep tracking who knows what and who has been exposed to what, so they have a better they have a better, they have a more comprehensive modus operandi. They have a more sophisticated machinery that they have to see as being deployed constantly. And in that sense, they are often, I mean, female borderlines can also certainly be incredibly Machiavellian, but essentially they can afford at least potentially to be less Machiavellian because they can always fall back on the glasshouse defense, which is this kind of societal convention that women are more uh, uh, virtuous or morally pure or less responsible or accountable for their actions. They can just sort of naturally take on the passive. I mean, it's interesting because I do think that a lot of that stereotype, that cultural convention, is somewhat crafted by borderline personality disorder. I think because it does tend to occur more among females, and this might also come from a kind of social evolutionary, a kind of adaptation that essentially it's kind of woven into the cultural social contract that women are too valuable, even if they have a personality disorder, not to be pandered to, not to be coped with, and simply having to live with that. And in some sense, you can even argue that borderline personality disorder among women on a societal level even potentially has pro-social effects. Um, in that it specializes and essentially scapegoats and outsources um, the male role as having to provide for and maintain uh, the simplistic generalizations which are leveraged by borderline personality disordered women. Um, so essentially, if you have to make a society that is anti-fragile to those kinds of heuristics that are being leveraged, um, you end up having to just be a much more capable um, or well administered. Yeah, in some sense, I think that this is also the general reason why women have been uh, traditionally uh, uh, suppressed on a political level, um, was to create a firewall between the political administration of a group which has always had to pander to the demands that were voiced and formulated by the kind of the borderline heuristic and shortcut of rationality. Um, I mean, this is. I mean, get into practical examples of this just to show the basic contrast. But essentially, I mean, you can say that women didn't have a political voice. They didn't have, but they could complain about things which a man could never complain about. They could seek justice for things and get a direct societal rage against men for things that men could never have a grievance about. So there is an asymmetry of protected interests in the traditional segregation of powers and rights between the sexes, that it wasn't just simply an asymmetry of power, that they were different powers. Um, I mean, one can argue that essentially women were dehumanized in some sense, but in some sense, I mean, I do think that my general summary of this is fairly accurate. That essentially, um, in order to preserve the most women, because women have a pro-social impact in that they allow a particular group to grow their numbers. Um, so if you just preserve and promote the greatest number of women and therefore tolerate many individual women that have borderline personality disorder, um, the cost being that essentially um, your culture has to put up with women that have a contingent within them that has this very toxic kind of consciousness, that then the trade-off is that you have to kind of suppress women as a group, because women as a group are going to be culturally leveraged by this toxic form of secondary psychopathy into a kind of mobilized cultural yeah. I mean, it's no. I mean, people that are actually historically serious about these things can even know that the largest part of the Nazi movement, in its success as a cultural movement, was that it was propagated by women. It was the female supporters of Nazism that propelled it culturally. Um, and it is the model of politics itself, which is, I mean, I've already argued how it's completely parallel with borderline personality disorder. It conceptualizes society in the same way that borderline personality disorder um, creates selectively tailored narratives and reductions and generalizations, which it expects its host to sort of pander to and to absorb and to deliver expectations and anticipations, or a kind of or personal justice in that subjective light, in that subjective point of view. Um, it wants its relativistic point of view to be pandered to. It's not willing to have it to take on any accountability for being mistaken. Um, it always wants its expectations and anticipations to result in a claim that should be claimed against the host if the host is not able to um, uh, derive some kind of interventionist. So this is why they want the male component uh, to be capable of being mobilized, of being propitiated into some kind of action. But okay, now I'm talking about a different kind of male component when I'm saying that when the whole society moves from the female version of borderline personality disorder onto the male version of personality disorder, it does that. To me, is the difference between proto-fascism and full-blown fascism. Um, and it's almost when there's a kind of crossing of the Rubicon, when the male borderline um, wheelhouse and toolkit gets the same status as gets the same cultural pass that individual female borderline personality disordered individuals feel when they can readily rely on the glasshouse defense. That when the glasshouse defense, which is a natural, assumption, which female borderline personality disordered people can depend on and rely on, when that status is given to the ideological narrative, which therefore can sustain a male borderline activation in the ideological sense, in the ideological context. Um, they can I wonder, because I've said before that, for example, the female borderline only has complete confidence when they know that they can always fob off their accountability or blameworthiness onto a host. When they can break the host up into mirror shards and scatter it and and have it strewn into the environment, woven into the environment, so that any gap in the narrative can just be filled in by that kind of reflective shard that allows them to see the reflection of their host. So the integrity of the host will absorb any of the kind of the cognitive dissonance in the murky narrative, as they can even then do the kind of the role reversal confidently, without any accountability, because essentially the environment itself is seeded um, as, as being caused by the host. Um, I mean, I've spoken that essentially. I mean, the thing that really ruins the house of mirrors for female borderline personality disordered people is that when they are directing the narrative, when they're actually voicing the narrative themselves, usually the narrative is generated in the mind passively of the male borderline host. Is the male? I'm saying male borderline, but actually they're not the ones with borderline, but they have it in the codependency context. That essentially the male borderline is in association with the female borderline, is decompartmentalized and made to feel bad for not delivering to the female what she desires and expects, and he's having problems dealing with the incommensurate and inconsistent demands, and but when the male borderline, let's say, stops being responsive because they know that there is no correct solution, and essentially they've started to unmask the pattern that essentially this is all just premised on a kind of sadistic, passively conceal, a kind of passive aggression, that the whole thing is fundamentally corrosive and insoluble, that what then happens is he starts to manage the female borderline, and the female borderline knows very quickly that they are not being reacted to in good faith, and in fact they don't like being addressed by their host. They want their host to be purely reactive to them, to their feelings. And so when the host is actually essentially not being a host anymore and dealing with them like they are supposed to have boundaries, and like they're supposed to actually have a kind of an outline of their entity that they're supposed to have some kind of responsibility for, then they'll either do one of two things. Well, they're one of two. They can either go to something like the glasshouse defense, or they can essentially do something that's a kind of similar to the glasshouse defense, where essentially they attack their host, but in a defensive way. And then there is the thing which is kind of leads on to the house of mirrors, which is that they actually produce their own voice of their own ego function. And the voice of their ego function essentially will only be fueled by the track record of the codependency that has already existed. And usually the voice of that ego function that they will voice will be very problematic to the relationship, because essentially they had been building up the other person as the masculine side of their borderline. That they were supposed to be administering an ego function to facilitate the kind of the codependent vehicle, the forward progress of the codependent vehicle, which was supposed to be fueled by their unconscious desires and their sort of mobile feeling body. So they were both sharing that feeling body. But then when they introduced the voice of the ego function, and they essentially treat the feeling body as a disposable commodity, essentially, as just a way to facilitate this voice of the ego function, which is fundamentally demeaning. It's fundamentally, it's quite disgusting, but in some sense, it because it manhandles the feeling body of the host. And this manhandling essentially shows that essentially they're not interested in actually coherent masculine energy. They only want masculine energy that is fundamentally there to facilitate the aggrandizement of this inconsistent, unconscious bundle of uncollated expectations, and just a complete bundle of descriptive mass. I mean, I didn't go into that aspect. That would have actually been I did in my original recordings about this. But essentially, this is the main problem with the borderline unconscious side of the mind, is that it's just a collection of descriptive mass, and they will hold on to that descriptive mass because they want somebody else to summarize it into a reward that is given to them. So they hold on to things, and they've got all this descriptive mass, and then they just want somebody else to infect it with, to tell it to, and then they're supposed to kind of give judgments of that descriptive mass. So they're just holding on to descriptive mass until they have a host to kind of inject it into, and then that host is supposed to translate that descriptive mass into some kind of motivation, which satiates the kind of, I mean, there's so many inconsistencies within the borderline functioning, because I mean, one of the weirdest things that they have is that they really believe in this kind of superficial cult of it's weird, but they really have this almost stereotype of social expectations and high status. They really want to be high status within society, but they don't want to achieve it. They want to be given it, and essentially they've got the mechanism to force that high status to be handed to them. And it comes essentially from this whole sort of toxic game. Yeah, I haven't done a good job of delineating all of this stuff out nicely, but I mean, the problem is as well is essentially that how they relate to their host is never consistent. They will just keep on creating new envelopes of descriptive mass to decompartmentalize their host, and essentially use these envelopes as a kind of push-button system of manipulation, where essentially they are depicting a narrative that their host is supposed to be constantly reacting to, and that is how they mediate reality, is by their host's reaction. And then when their host stops giving them good faith reactions to their envelopes and starts repudiating the envelopes or trying to have a two-way flow on those envelopes, then they either do the glasshouse defense, they attack the host directly, or they, let's say, supplement what the host should be doing by giving the voice of the host's ego function for them, but they still want their host to kind of absorb all the blame and accountability of why they haven't already been delivered what it is that they expect, based on the resource of this descriptive mass and this bundle of descriptive mass. So, I mean, the ideology functions in the same way as the personality disorder, is that they've got this bank of descriptive mass, and they are keen to leverage it, according to some kind of prosecutor's fallacy, essentially. And then they just have a whole industry, essentially, of manufactured rationalization and alignment of facts and reality that conforms to this tactic, essentially, that is conducive to this same pattern of okay, so moving on from that, now the crux of what I was trying to add onto the story is that when this gains enough, let's say, cultural mass, when this has a strong enough cultural hegemony, I think the whole breakpoint in the system is when you can get into the kind of the fascistic hyperrealism of culture, in which this just becomes so normalized. This corrupt pseudo-intellectual culture of forcing people to absorb this kind of sadistically edged modus operandi, that effectively the in the same way that an individual female with borderline personality disorder can feel comfortable relying on the glasshouse defense, that when the male variant of borderline personality disorder, which is fundamentally has to be, let's say, justified within a particular cultural edifice, when that becomes indistinguishable to the female, then they can just act without even introducing it. They can just move without. They can just articulate the expression of it without the verbal introduction, as it were. They can just go on the killing spree, as it were. They can just, the Kristallnacht becomes viable, essentially. And you know and you can see the temperature of this constantly rising, as the toxicity continues to be expanded, because even as they are detractors to this ideology, they are held at bay, they are ostracized. The law itself is corrupted in order to facilitate this disgusting orthodoxy and its cultural hegemony. All standards are perverted to facilitate its reach. And it destroys discourse. I mean, it virulently attacks discourse that that challenges its sacred cows and its really convoluted premises, essentially. because there's a whole slew of very basic questions that can be asked that just put it on its head, and essentially those questions all become taboo questions essentially, and they're policed by these field marshals and these moral enforcers of this mafia style culture. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I didn't explain that well, but essentially, I mean, I was just trying to make the thing that, I mean, I can only hope that within the current trajectory, it's not possible for them to cross the Rubicon. But in some sense, if they hold the levers of power, if they can essentially label all dissidents as using hate speech, and they can make it against the law to essentially politically disagree with their vile racialist propaganda and worldview and fascist conceptualization of society and morality. If they make it effectively illegal to challenge them, then essentially, it's just a matter of time. It's a kind of like it's a constant dwindling spiral. As they drown out the alternative perspective, and they continue essentially the betrayal of non-racialism. Yeah, I mean, I guess it fills my mind with how children's minds are being polluted by this disgusting racialist creed, and there's raising a whole generation uh, in this in the light of this toxic social justice cult, which implants this fascistic conception of society and morality. I've just come back to this recording after being interrupted, so I've lost that particular thread. But to set up, I guess, the double standard and inconsistencies that are woven into this kind of mentality is that essentially, because you're relying on a kind of cosmic, universal moral claim that frames your advocacy or your particular brand of solution, it doesn't matter that you can't substantiate your whatever it is that you're promoting as the solution in pragmatic terms. You don't ever have to bear that burden of proof. You just have to defend the generalizations that your cosmic justice pertains to. And so all you have to do is essentially leverage some kind of conjecture or speculation that if other people can't defend against your accusations, then your generalization must stand. And so, there's no gray area. It's a binary of, does the ideology become applicable? And it only becomes applicable if something like, if its generalization can't be utterly refuted. And so you've got this very strange kind of intellectual dishonesty. In some sense, it signifies a culture, an intellectual culture that's completely founded on the prosecutor's fallacy, and it is just as brittle and vicious as Nazi and fascist societies are, because that's what happens when your whole intellectual edifice is so badly hedged and woven into everything, and it creates a kind of a false consciousness and a false, let's say, economy of intellectualism that has to service and cover over and sort of dress with some kind of orthodox or conventional tokens of austere of a kind of austere um, uh, to me, it's just so sickening how it falls foul of essentially exactly what is described by epistemic conduciveness, that it produces icons and tokens of epistemic conduciveness, which, to me, it is fundamentally absurd how Catherine Elgin can be in this kind of meta epistemic conduciveness by essentially looking at epistemic communities and knowledge communities in this kind of disembodied kind of contradiction or paradox, contradiction in terms of judging the system beyond the system. And creating it's strange, but it's what I would describe as a you see, and this comes also directly in when you're dealing with this nebulous and convoluted, incoherent term that is only sort of vaguely gestured at and deployed and used in such a reprehensible way, without any clear thinking attached to it, that epistemic injustice, you can actually make claims about epistemic injustice leading to kind of actionable compensations within some kind of matrix, but the calculation of loss within epistemic injustice, which should be impossible, because it's fundamentally an unknown quantity, and so when you invoke it, you can use it to justify absolutely anything. When you invoke it, there's no limit attached to it, because because the actual calculation of loss it is attached, and it implies a hypothetical calculation. The calculation of it, to quantify it, is fundamentally hypothetical. And it forces you into fudging reality into some kind of general metric of dehumanizing, things that just completely contradict the categorical imperative from a Kantian point of view. So you have this very malleable, prospective, positivistic, you can just see how this is the kind of the spawning grounds of what the Nazis precipitated, the Führer principle, and you can see it philosophically essentially being driven at, and it's like the holy grail in this particular disgusting pseudo-intellectual subculture, which infests much of academia. Um, Almost the majority, because of its mafia style uh, of sort of being able to leverage the hypothetical, um, and to essentially just completely, through almost gainsaying, just completely incept, chairing the narrative and framing reality unilaterally. Um, and it never poses any test about how it could be falsified itself. It's so fundamentally um, presumptuous in its own sort of right to be the corrective metric, the field of this kind of universal rationality. Of this sort of this armchair judging everything from nowhere. Um, okay, let me just go back to some of the things that I was saying. Let me just quickly go find my notes. Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting that epistemic injustice wouldn't reach the level of stupidity and toxicity that it does without already the kind of, I would call, the intellectual garbage of that has centered around the term social injustice, which is, I always find quite ironic, because how social injustice is thought of now in the vernacular is so antithetical to how George Orwell referred to it. It's the complete inverse. It's like, the social injustice belongs to the system of society instead of to the individual. It's been completely turned on its head. But it's interesting. This intellectual corruption, I do think that there is a pattern of it. I mean, Kantians get into the same bullshit essentially, because they, as soon as they start essentially handing the categorical imperative off to a kind of institutional edifice that is meant to safeguard or guarantee the categorical imperative, you get a kind of a strange secondary economy of morality that becomes a kind of utilitarian monster, and is able to make these hypothetical calculations. And so, you end up in their court of how they tout their particular salience, and how they have their linchpins to conduct this universal matrix of universal truth and cosmic justice. And essentially, the frame of the argument which is essentially the only form of the argument that they're capable of engaging in, is if they have found the right conducive trigger to lay down and project their kind of their matrix of cosmic justice. And so essentially they will only accept being refuted if you substitute what they can attach, this kind of systemic guilt and cosmic justice. You have to give them a different prosecutor's fallacy, essentially, in order to leverage the same kind of prescriptive disembodied armchair, judgment over everything, from this kind of certitude, and you can use anything to do this. You can use epistemic communities, you can use racial generalizations and categorization, you can use historical fudge generalizations, which actually I am going to. There was a lecturer that I heard speak on epistemic injustice, and I preemptively sent her an email, and I'm going to read out that email, because it will probably touch on some of these points in a completely different what was it, the University of how am I going to find this? It's not going to be hard to find. Just pause this while I find it. Okay, I found the lecture. So this was before I had already sort of dabbled into thinking about why does Catherine Elgin seem to have such a coherent philosophy over epistemic responsibilism, but yet she seems to echo these stupid sentiments that correspond to essentially this fad in academia, that this identity politics bullshit and such. And why does she fall into spouting a lot of that sort of propaganda? I personally saw her complaining, quite sourly about, gender disparity and things like that in the representation of certain departments and things like that, essentially. But I know that how she framed it, that there was a gleaming contradiction in terms of how she was utilizing that and how it fell foul of her general, usually very coherent and principled thinking. Now she would leverage these token, that there's just some kind of that obviously if there's no parity in terms of outcome, that there's no explanation other than some kind of systemic oppression. That kind of begging the question is just so. Anyway, so I mean that was what got me sort of trying to work out exactly how to quantify or technically elaborate where is the mismatch in the thinking. So anyway, so this was a lecture about epistemic injustice, and it was actually quite, after watching this lecture or after attending this lecture, I mean it was very disgusting. It was, I mean, I could only describe it as the kind of the beginnings of trying to identify the problems so that they can be overcome, so that a more clear Führer principle can be developed, essentially, about how to escape relativism in trying to develop a cogent formulation of identity politics, essentially, and so that epistemic injustice can be very clearly administered, or from a policy perspective, or from a cultural, moral, kind of system or something like that. But anyway, I sent this email before I saw her lecture, which I haven't probably gone through, but I'm just sort of giving my the summary of my reaction to it, essentially. But okay, anyway. Hello, Professor. I'm sorry for this perhaps premature email. I am quite passionate about many of the topics you have mentioned on your UJ profile. I am not academically I'm not an academically trained philosopher, but I am often able to decipher academic texts upon inspection or upon further evaluation after some research. In brackets, so if this is not untoward, please could provide me with some of your papers germane to your talk. Next paragraph. I have been tracking many of these issues as I believe academia and culture at large is intertwined in many fundamental specious concerns involving the topics which you are focused on exploring. I am keen to barrage you with some of my contentions to see where you stand in relation to those positions and concerns, but that would probably be a bit too brash to subject you to in a self-introductory email such as this. Next paragraph. I have a YouTube channel which is mostly an embarrassing assortment of rambling recordings where I try to illustrate outlines of many fundamental concerns which I believe are being overlooked by the current fashion of politics/culture/academia. I do have descriptions of what the intellectual themes which underpin the advent of what I can only describe as a pernicious form of positivistic rationalism, which I connect with what Catherine Elgren describes as epistemic reliabilism. Many of your named interests, which seem to bring you close to the position of epistemic responsibilism, perhaps the same espoused by Catherine Elgin, I have noticed in Professor Elgin's exploration of some of her topics, she focuses on a concept of knowledge community, which she links to a necessity against prejudice and arbitrary discrimination, which some of her illustrations seem to expect a certain level of representative parity, which she conflates with an equality principle. I find this sort of presumed heuristic of quantitative parity to fall foul of her own philosophical treatment of epistemic reliabilism, because she treats epistemic reliabilism very suspiciously, as one should, because it is a problematic epistemology. And so now I am imagining that at least thematically your talk about decolonization might trace a similar form of treatment, outlining the a priori need to entrench a knowledge community infused with the principles of equality, and then convoluting that necessity with some treatment of the effects of social constructs and other such generalized measurements applied to generalized entities, i.e. identity groups, which are effectively vested with a prime claim on moral consideration, which in turn necessitates the imposition of the claim that forms of group identity are indispensably conducive to the individual's moral integrity, which can be speciously substituted with an inductive argument that must continue to grow its rationalizations of aligning all facts into its formulaic and semantic equivalences, while table thumping all of its presumed premises, which are never honestly invigilated, because the continuing rationalizations require those philosophical issues to simply be hysterically begged. In square brackets, by the way, this is very similar to the workings of personality styles which are prone to covert narcissism, who repurpose the conditions of narcissistic abuse imposed by others in order to conceal an efficient deployment of similar mechanics, but with the excuse of outsourcing responsibility for utilizing play in the same game. To further round out my point, in a political context, any heuristics of generalization might be used to construct outlines of rehabilitative policy and intervention upon social structures. But these heuristics cannot be infused into implementation of such policy, but must be bound to their teleological outlook. The convolution of a good enough teleos that justifies the instrumentalization of individuals or citizenry, in brackets, into representative treatment, into a representative treatment of identity group, of group identity, that is presumed to contain a primary measure of moral consideration, close brackets, can only be achieved in a culture which promulgates identity realism and a fundamental dissolution of normative moral principles. Next sentence, I'm sorry for this rather brash and rambling assessment. Although not well explained, it might offer some inspirational themes to consider. Next paragraph. And now I have just done what I said I would not try to do, attempted to imagine my most nightmarish interpretation of your subject matter, which I have yet to hear your views on. Suffice to say, it will be very interesting to hear your definition of decolonization and philosophical treatment of race within a normative paradigm. I believe myself to be in quite a simple philosophical position on these matters, merely subscribing to non-racialism, which enforces a set of normative criteria which I believe enhances liberty rather than making the claim of achieving perfect liberty in some static contention which would only make sense in relation to some obscure reduction of reality into a historical orthodoxy which freezes an imprint of identity into processes of conditioning which impels a form of reactive moral compliance. Which is somewhat me trying to describe how essentially this is a form of moral reliabilism as well, in brackets, which simultaneously creates further investments into identity consciousness and enhanced freedom for the historical identity, almost in brackets only, I'm adding that, that essentially it's only looking to enhance the historical identity, which has merely adopted its moral consideration from the people which it has accorded as possessing, i.e. the identity must own you if it is taken to be a proxy of normative consideration. And then I said in my final paragraph, I'm sorry for the barrage of oversharing, but if you read this email, perhaps you will find use or interesting response to any of my comments. I'm open to discussion. I hope that it is possible and that your views aren't sufficiently diametrically opposed to mine that I will not hear a response from you. But otherwise, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to get a hold of some of your papers if you are comfortable and at liberty to disseminate them to me. Faithfully, Stephen. So I sent that email. She gave me a kind of strange response, which she said she doesn't have the time to respond, and then she said that she was a card-carrying holder of being an epistemic responsibilist. But yeah, obviously. Anyway, the reason why I read out this email was, I guess one of the arguments that's weird. I thought that I actually made a larger claim about the problem of how time gets associated with identity. Essentially, that a kind of that a universal metric gets imprinted on by a kind of by. Yeah, that is actually strange. So I don't know. I remember constructing an argument preemptively because I anticipated that. I mean, it was quite disgusting watching her talk as well, because she just kind of outlined that those very broad premises that identity politics is founded on. And so, she just kind of generalized the past into presuming that essentially that it is right that a hologram of history is kind of projected onto the present, and that we're seeing the same thing, and that these things are fundamentally systemically products of a single state which conserves all of its social injustice. That's just completely presumed. And obviously that has to be presumed, because otherwise you can't essentially pretend to be trying to tackle real issues in the present using a kind of morality, a specious form of moral generalization and essentially de facto racial realism.
Anyway, okay, that didn't go into the interesting part that I hoped it might. Because I must have made a paragraph and then saved it somewhere and not included it in the email about how the absurdities of this way of thinking essentially create a kind of epoch that ends up being reduced into a static act that is like undeniable, and that act becomes a kind of a point in a causal chain. And it's like, it sort of, it forces this strange false dichotomy that the only way to fix the present is to fix history, which is animated in the present. And it's got this weird kind of spiritual fascism that essentially, instead of saying that your genetics lives within you, it's like your historical memory lives within you. And it's got that same kind of mythologized ethnic Darwinism, just it's happening on the level of a kind of historical naturalism, and that how history was made unnatural by a kind of by a corruption of the moral cosmic fabric, which is group orientated and subjective and relativistic, and essentially, and then it can leverage this kind of utopian counterfactual that never came to be because it was interrupted by the mixing of the separate and presumed equal cultures. And so there's no kind of dimension in which everyone is standing on the same plane, that everyone is sharing the same reality. It's like, no, we've got someone with a dominant bubble and someone with a bubble that needs to be re that someone's bubble was shattered, and so that epistemic injustice must be translated into uh, um, yeah. See, this kind of description doesn't get into the detail that it needs to get into, in terms of the psychological aspect, because I mean, it really is. It operates exactly like borderline personality disorder in terms of finding a codependent host. Um, so that it can essentially use somebody else's ego function to and feeling body to absorb the unconscious dissonance that never has to create its own social vehicle. Um, and so by taking this kind of passive role, it can just sort of intrinsically always just claim a kind of I mean, if you want to make that kind of claim, you can see how it is intrinsically kind of set up as a kind of it's got the same kind of philosophical construction as wanting to have ethnostates, essentially. But I mean, this is the only thing that I think makes it proto-fascist, is that at least the fascist will somewhat will say that they are going to be responsible under this philosophical conception of society, and say, okay, well, um, what we want is a complete segregation, whereas this is kind of proto-fascist because the idea is that we need a kind of participatory role reversal that exhausts the social injustice that is charged up, and it treats it like a complete moral formulation. Um, and it's such a toxic moral formulation that is so disconnected from pragmatic issues and pragmatic problems on the ground as individuals face challenges of development, because it can only um, reward justice to the identity and not to the individual. It forces um, a whole virtual set of ills and challenges which are completely disconnected from reality, because essentially it can only deal within this kind of this convoluted sub-realm of social constructions, um, and essentially it can only get away with that kind of bait and switch if it also kind of just gestures or hand waves that, well, reality is also socially constructed. So just as race is socially constructed and reality is socially constructed, reality is only constructed by race. That's the kind of the false reduction that they are kind of skating by with. And they can't, I mean, in some sense it's worse because, like when I'm complaining about the technical problems of that rationality on this level is only a measure of self-consistency. It's not a measure of truthfulness or correctness. They've kind of, just because something is self-consistent doesn't mean that it's not incoherent, doesn't mean that it's not ludicrous. But they've got such a toxic, contemplative, defensive thing that if you attack the integrity of their deplorable intellectual edifice, well, I mean, I guess they just call you a racist, and they have no way of being sensitive to the fact that their intellectual schema is incoherent. And in fact, this creates a whole secondary economy of pseudo-intellectual hackery, essentially, and propaganda and cultural propaganda and journalism is to patch over this weakness, essentially, and to create this kind of mafia style of cultural bullying, and these kinds of these field marshals, which are I mean they serve the same function as the grand dragon viziers in the Ku Klux Klan. They have the same cultural function, essentially, is they are there to maintain the mythology and the mythos that entrenches the cultural necessity of essentially this culture, which is founded on the prosecutor's fallacy, essentially. And so deferring and diverting pressure from the intellectual brittleness of the whole system, and defending the generalizations, defending the cartoonish caricature reductions of reality, and the simplistic sort of equating of the present with history. Which, I mean, the worst possible outcome of all of this is that essentially black plutocratic kleptocrats and elites can just keep on using the disadvantaged as a human shield to continue to create more identity chauvinism and corruption of the system, because disadvantage belongs to the identity and not to the individual. And so they rob the system of the capacity to actually diagnose and process any kind of ameliorative or palliative support, which gets completely diverted into this mafia ideological economy, essentially, with what I can only describe as flying monkeys, which is a psychological term coined to denote those who assist covert, kind of subcultures that are centered around narcissistic individuals that need helpers in order to effect their their supply of what is actually just called narcissistic supply, because they have to create disruptions and commotion, because if they don't have other people's ego functions telling them what's happening in reality, they don't have an internal epistemic measure. They can only outsource it. And this is why the ideology is fundamentally based in retributivistic sort of sadism, because you can't, like, the solution can't work unless someone is suffering in order to redistribute the negative hurt that was done historically. It's this weird idea that essentially, like, I mean, almost fundamentally, what can you do about epistemic injustice? I mean, if there has been epistemic injustice, there's nothing that can be done. Something that was known is no longer known by anyone. It's been forgotten. It's gone. So what can you do to compensate? The only thing you can do is to make somebody else forget something about their culture, so that the negative is even on both sides somehow. So you have to diminish somebody else so that the negative subtraction is the same across the board, or something like that. That's the only way that you can equalize the identities in terms of epistemic injustice. So in some sense, it's a redistribution of discomfort and pain. It's fundamentally sadistic. And it also, it has to find icons to absorb that pressure. It has to find scapegoats. It has to find token sacrifices, human sacrifices. It's fundamentally an ideology of cannibalism. And in some sense, that's what it does. Is it propels a system towards a kind of a lower state of general, a greater amount of general deprivation, but that deprivation becomes directed by this moral compass, essentially, which according to its own resources or its own faculties, it measures as being affected in manifesting a higher rate of rationality, a higher rate of self-consistency within its measure, within its moral evaluation of the world. I guess the only difference between full-blown fascism and this ideology, although they share the same conception of reality and society and conceptualization of philosophical affairs, the fascist essentially has essentially defined some kind of Führer principle so that they can just live out a kind of relativistic subjectivity in which they want to be insulated, and they want to drive at asserting their dominance and invulnerability, at least, to the other candidate competitors. Whereas the proto-fascist, instead of actively participating in that kind of contest, is just passively absorbing a hypothetical calculation of loss, which outlines the same contest in some sense, but it's just claimed in reverse. It's claimed according to this kind of codependent sort of retributivistic, and I mean, I guess in some sense it might tend towards something like a Soviet Union style of caste rule by some nomenclature, because they nomenclatura that have a promise that they are guaranteeing the society from being taken advantage of according to whatever sensitive semantic formulation has been set up in terms of describing the vector of vulnerability, or the vector of or whatever formula of calculation of the cosmic injustice, of the rational cosmic subversion, which is, contained within a kind of a static polemic, which is it's interesting because I think as well, like, these things are fundamentally brittle. They can't function. If you try to center a culture around them, they become like fractals. They just explode in their complexity, and they just end up creating themselves at deeper levels, in which they invert all of the properties that they complain about anyway, in terms of assigning inverse roles to the same people. And so, I can't believe that this hasn't already been seen, that essentially, that when you have identity politics ruling policy, that essentially you have a black privilege. You are creating a black privilege, and the only excuse for it is that it's meant to be diametrically equal and opposite to the historical injustice. And the problem is that the formulation of this black privilege is fundamentally unconstructive. It's fundamentally unremedial. It doesn't function. It functions for a few elite, and essentially it taxes the entire system to do that. It destabilizes the entire system, and it ends up, in fact, even creating more problems. It exacerbates, because it slows down the efficiency that natural signaling would facilitate, essentially, because you can't do anything you can't develop naturally or organically or fluidly. You have to develop according to a superficial feature that is selected for its disruption. So you can't target people based on their disadvantage. You have to target people based on their disadvantaged identity. And so you can't work with the natural contract that already exists within the individual sphere and the interpersonal sphere. So the interpersonal sphere is completely sequestered, it's completely broken down, it's disintegrated into this ideological generalization of toxic identity politics. So everything must be seen and viewed through the filter of identity. And that becomes such a stultifying and regressive measure Well, it's interesting how, and then within the ideological confine, there is no way to actually self-invigilate. There's no way to mount any kind of introspective self-criticism for perpetrating this kind of ideology. It doesn't have any checks and balances on itself. So it can only double down. It can't be wrong by its own formulation. It cannot be questioned. It's a one-party state ideology. It's a one-party state cultural proclivity and pseudo-intellectual. It is the end of democracy in functional terms. In terms of real political economy, it's just the end. it can't deal with serious sense making. It can't deal with interrogating reality other than through its orthodoxy. Um, and it cannot permit anything to sort of exist that it constantly agitates and threatens anything that doesn't conform to it.